For centuries, the East India Company was a business with remarkable power. It was a corporation that ruled territory, commanded armies, and collected taxes from millions of people. At its peak, the company controlled vast parts of India and oversaw trade routes stretching from Asia to Europe and the Americas. More than 100 years after it was dissolved, the name was revived this time as a luxury brand. But even that modern incarnation has now collapsed. In February 2026, the revived East India Company filed for bankruptcy in England, citing mounting debts. A name once associated with global power has finally ceased to exist. Yet the story of the East India Company remains one of the most extraordinary and controversial chapters in the history of capitalism. I'm Afzal Ahmed and this is Aloud. This show brings you articles made for audio. In this episode, we've adapted the piece East India Company. The curtain falls on British firm that once ruled India with a private army, published on TRT World on February the 27th, 2026. The company was born in an age of spice. In the late 1500s, Europe was obsessed with spices from Southeast Asia, such as nutmeg, cloves, and pepper. These ingredients preserved food before refrigeration, enhanced flavor, and sometimes even masked the taste of spoiled meat. But the lucrative sea routes to the so-called Spice Islands in present-day Indonesia was dominated by Portuguese and Dutch traders. English merchants wanted a share. So in 1600, a group of London businessmen petitioned Queen Elizabeth I for permission to form a new trading enterprise. She granted them a royal charter on the last day of the year, and the East India Company was born. What made the company revolutionary was its structure. The East India Company was one of the world's first joint stock companies. Investors could buy shares and pool their money into a large venture, spreading the risk among many participants. This concept introduced something new to global commerce: limited liability. Investors would only lose the money they invested rather than their entire fortunes. The model proved incredibly attractive. Profits from the spice trade could reach 400%. Soon, investors poured money into the company. With those funds, it built fleets of ships that rivaled the naval forces of entire nations. The company's stock was traded on what became the London Stock Exchange 200 years later. Competition soon turned violent. The Dutch East India Company, founded just 2 years later, became a fierce rival. In 1623, Dutch officials executed English traders during what became known as the Amboina Massacre, deepening tensions between the two powers. For the East India Company, the lesson was clear. Trade needed force, so the company began raising its own army. By the mid-1700s, the East India Company commanded more than 250,000 soldiers, roughly twice the size of Britain's standing army at the time. To fund its military expenses, the trading firm levied taxes on territories it controlled. These troops saw allegiance not to the British Crown, but to the company itself. In effect, a corporation had become a state. The turning point came in 1757. At the Battle of Plassey, a relatively small East India Company force of about 3,000 troops defeated the much larger 50,000-strong army of the Nawab of Bengal and his French allies. The victory was secured through bribery, political intrigue, and betrayal within the Bengal court. The company's commander, Robert Clive, emerged from the battle enormously wealthy. Soon after, the East India Company became the dominant power in Bengal, one of the richest regions in the world. From there, its influence expanded across the Indian subcontinent. The corporation now collected taxes, administered territory, and ruled millions. At the late 18th century, the East India Company had become a central engine of global trade. It shipped tea from China, cotton from India, and spices from Southeast Asia. At one point, it handled more than half of the world's trade in certain goods. Tea became one of its most profitable commodities, and the company's control over tea exports even helped ignite a political crisis across the Atlantic. In 1773, American colonists protested British tax policies by throwing East India Company tea into Boston Harbor. The Boston Tea Party became one of the defining moments leading to the American Revolution. The East India Company pioneered the concept of global supply chains, but the company's expansion came at a devastating human cost. In India, farmers were often forced to grow cash crops such as indigo for export, sometimes instead of food. As de facto ruler of Bengal, the East India Company collected taxes after the Battle of Plassey, pushing the peasants into extreme poverty. The consequences were catastrophic during the Bengal famine of 1769 to 1770. A severe drought struck the region, yet grain reserves that could have fed starving populations were still exported for profit. Millions died. Eyewitness accounts show horrific conditions, with people resorting to cannibalism. Economists like Nobel laureate Amartya Sen estimate the death toll at around 10 million people, roughly equal to the population of London today. The disaster remains one of the darkest chapters associated with the company's rule. By the 19th century, criticism of the East India Company had grown. Scandals, corruption allegations, and humanitarian concerns led to parliamentary inquiries in Britain. Gradually, the government began stripping away the company's monopolies. Its exclusive rights to trade with India ended in 1813 and with China in 1833. But the final blow came with the Indian Rebellion of 1857, often called the Sepoy Mutiny. Sparked partly by rumors that rifle cartridges provided by the company were greased with cow and pig fat, offensive to Hindu and Muslim soldiers alike, the uprising spread across northern India. After months of extreme acts of violence by the British government intervened directly. In 1858, the British Crown formally took control of India. The East India Company lost its governing powers. The once mighty corporation faded quickly after that. Its administrative functions were absorbed by the British state. Its private army merged into the British military, and in 1874, the British Parliament officially dissolved the company, after nearly 3 centuries of existence. More than a century later, its name returned. In 2010, Indian businessman Sanjeev Mehta purchased a dormant trademark for around £10 million, in a move seen as a form of revenge for the colonized. He revived it as a luxury brand selling tea, chocolates, spices, and heritage-inspired products. The move carried symbolic meaning. A company that once ruled India was now owned by an Indian, Sanjeev Mehta said in 2020, adding it was a feeling of the empire striking back. But nostalgia alone could not sustain the business. In February 2026, the modern East India Company filed for insolvency. The empire of trade that once governed 200 million people had been reduced to a struggling brand, and finally its demise came. The rise and fall of the East India Company still resonates today. It pioneered corporate structures that shaped modern capitalism, but it also demonstrated the immense power and potential danger of corporations operating beyond meaningful oversight. It remains a warning about what can happen when profit and power merge without limits. That's all for this episode of Aloud, based on the piece East India Company, The Curtain Falls on British Firm That Once Ruled India with a Private Army, published on TRT World on February the 27th, 2026. I'm your host Afzal Ahmed. Thanks for listening.